Okay. Hi, I'm David Chislett, and I'm a creativity trainer based in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. For me, I believe that absolutely everybody in the world is creative. I do believe that that is the hallmark of human intelligence, not many of the other things that you may have heard of. The reason why I believe this is, in fact, that all of us are totally capable of coming up with new ways to look at the world, which allow us to do things that either we thought were impossible before or that we just couldn't figure out. Even the most simple aha moment is, in fact, a creative second where you are joining the dots between pieces of disparate information to create a point of view that you didn't have beforehand. So for me, that is the jumping off point. It's a continuum. It's not a point on a graph. Creativity is like a curve, and different people are at different places on that graph.
Yes, a lot of people say that in the same way that intelligence is a continuum. Some people are highly intelligent and others are, we can say we are of average intelligence. It's similar with creativity, that there's a continuum. Some people are naturally highly creative and others might be more intelligent in different aspects. But when you talk about everyone being creative, how exactly are you defining creativity?
Well, for me, I think the biggest problem when you use the word creativity is that most people immediately jump into what psychologists refer to as the big C, being Michelangelo or Steve Jobs, being the top of the range, high line, high art. And I'm much more of a believer in the 4 C's of creativity, starting off from mini C, moving through to little c, professional C, and then only big C. And to move through that continuum requires focused, dedicated effort, the acquiring of new information, and practice, rigorous practice to move yourself through the different levels. So for me, it's, unlike intelligence, I don't feel that some people either just are more creative than others. Sure, some people have had more practice, but I do believe that if you are prepared to put in the work, you can become more creative. Whether you become Michelangelo, well, maybe that is talent, but you can certainly be more creative than you are today if you put your mind to it.
Yes, and a lot of people refer to that as everyday creativity, like what you call the little c creativity or mini c creativity. People can call that everyday creativity. For example, a flower arrangement can be highly creative, and it can fulfill those 2 criteria of creativity: originality and value, because it gives pleasure to the person who receives that flower arrangement, and it might be a very unique way of doing a flower arrangement that is very aesthetic and beautiful. But I was talking a couple of days ago to someone who works in a youth offender institute, and she works with young people who are highly creative in selling drugs, for example. So how would you distinguish between creativity, for example, selling drugs? There's lots of creative ways of doing that. How would you distinguish between that kind of creativity and the kind of creativity that I suppose that you teach people to develop?
Well, I'd say the young offenders are probably highly creative in exactly the same way as I would teach a businessman to become more creative about how they do what they do. The difference is, I guess, they're joining a different set of dots and they have different imperatives. So the most important thing for creativity is intrinsic motivation, to borrow a term from the idea of flow. And if you're a drug dealer, well, I think the motivation is mostly extrinsic. It's financial reward, it's status, it's got nothing to do with achieving anything internally. And most of the time when you talk to people who want to be more creative, it's got a lot to do with purpose and about being able to achieve and to self-actualize in the world, be more happy. So I draw the distinction there, I think. I have heard this before, people trying to say, yeah, but creativity can be so negative. In fact, well, so can a butcher's knife, but that's not really the point. Our world is moving so fast, and progress is rewriting the rule books on so many different things, be that the way that we socialize, the way that we work, the way that we commute, the entire concept of what value is, if you compare what happened to the music industry now to what it was like in the 50s. So on many levels, progress itself seems to be almost amoral rather than immoral. And I think often the impact of creativity on everyday lives can be hard because it changes things. And as human beings, we like our patterns. We're not too fond of things changing, especially when it's not something we personally looked out for. Now, when you start talking about wanting to be creative with things like, society, yes, obviously people need to act in an ethical way. But I'm not sure that creativity of itself is something that admits to ethics.
We can talk about something like the creation of plastic, for example. At the time that plastic was created, it could have been perceived to be a highly creative and valuable way of saving resources that were limited. And now we can see the damage that plastic has caused to the oceans, to the ecosystem in general. So that's what I was thinking of when I said it's not always ethical, and we don't always consider the ethics when we're being creative.
Well, I think the example you've given is a good one because it just points out how tricky this all is. I mean, was there enough information available at the time to join the dots and go, oh, hang on, this may be cheap and efficient, but it's going to have these side effects? I'm pretty sure that information was not available. And that's a really good example of how creativity continues to roll. As things change, more dots become available so that more connections can be made, so more change can occur. It needs to move onto a sort of self-correcting curve rather than staying on a unidirectional kind of force of nature. And unfortunately, that's what happens when you put a commercial imperative behind a creative idea, isn't it? Now you've got this unstoppable force of plastic, which is wrong and needs to change. If you think back to what Einstein said after the creation of the atomic bomb, it's like, oops, what have we done? Human beings are really bad at predicting the future. We're really good at seeing patterns from the past, and we tend to extrapolate them into the future as if they're going to hold true. And quite often we are amazed by the results when it doesn't quite go according to how we assumed it would. The community you have around you as any kind of creative is massively important. And I think just to pick up on your thought there about the mechanization and progress, I mean, it's brutal, isn't it? That the machines, in actual fact, are what is going to remove the need for the machines. In many ways, the advances of AI and automation are, in fact, pushing human beings back into a world where being human and the human ability to invent and come up with ideas and think outside of the box and be less literal is becoming increasingly important. It's borderline ironic. But yes, for me, the most important thing that I want to get across to anybody who's engaged with this idea of being more creative is that you need to be skeptical about everything that's gone before, because as you've pointed out, that all comes from a very specific point of view. Now, I don't come from a business world. I come from an arts creative world where the whole point was to do things completely differently. And that for me is a very important, and possibly in a business world, a great unique selling point, is to, instead of be thinking of the normal conclusions, to really be thinking of shared value change, mutual outcomes, and collaboration to make things better for everybody, not just for the guy who holds the most shares. As a musician and as a writer, I was engaged in a process which didn't admit to the kind of strict timelines that project managers and businesses tend to enjoy. What's ironic about that is that those same project managers and managers now have to become tolerant of that process and learn to understand it more, because it's possibly the only thing that's going to get us out of the jam that modern technology has kind of painted us into right now. I'm a bit of a rare beast. I'm a very structured creative. So deadlines for me are just, another goal at the end of the day. I'm engaged in my craft every day. So when someone says I need something by a certain point in time, it's more about rearranging what I do when to be able to meet that deadline. In fact, I welcome a deadline because it means that I have an external focus pressure that requires me to put a shape on what I'm thinking and doing rather than just allowing me to, chase it off to its natural conclusion. The moment you have a deadline or you have a particular brief, the intellectual side of your brain starts making a hell of a lot of noise. And it's quite difficult to discern that little aha quiet pop going off in the corner. So it can affect results. But if you are the kind of person that spends a lot of time knowing this and working in a quiet environment, it is possible to tune that kind of pressure out and still do your work. It doesn't have to get in the way. But it's true, for people who are not schooled and who don't practice rigorously, it can easily be a disruptive factor. Building time for innovation into your daily schedule, you can't just expect it to pop fully formed from the heavens at the end of the week when suddenly you realize your competitors are outdoing you in some area. You've got to leave room for it. And yeah, Google's popularized this notion of play, but it doesn't just have to be that. It could just be freedom. Not micromanaging people, not insisting on tiny segments of time, and understanding that people are going to need some quiet time. Sometimes play can be too noisy as well.
Yes. So as an employer, I mean, I don't know how big your business is, but we all have to start from somewhere. So if you're, let's think back to when you first started to employ people. Were you willing to pay them for coming to work and be playful?
When I first started, probably not. But bear in mind that I was working in the entertainment business, so I think quite a lot of our work might well have been considered play by a number of people. And I think that's one of the reasons why creative industries, not just on stage, as it were, but behind the scenes, tend to attract a slightly maverick kind of a person, because the work in itself doesn't feel often like work. It does feel more like play, which gives you sometimes some very interesting results.
And some people say that very often these mavericks have to work for themselves because no one else will pay them. So they have to finance their own work or their own playtime.
Yeah. Well, it's not uncommon to hear people, sort of management level people talking about creative types as disruptive, as troublesome, as impossible to manage. Quite often people who are activated don't fit very nicely into our widget world. But the trouble is, the corporate modern world is underpinned by the notion of intellectual property and rights. And where does that come from? It comes from creative people. So many of these executive control freak types really need to take a reality check and ask themselves where it's all coming from before they get all judgmental about whether somebody is a suitable employee or not. I think that has resulted in many people starting their own thing and making their own fortunes when, if they had been allowed to stay in a job somewhere, maybe we'd live in a different world.
Well, David, I think it comes down to recognition, because by definition, somebody who's highly creative, the value of what they're doing is not often recognized by those around them because it's so new.
Right. And, that brings us to this whole idea of the creative curve, which Alan Gannett has just published a very interesting book about. If your creative idea is so far ahead of the curve that nobody gets it, is there any value in that? And I think that's often what happens to people, is that how far ahead a big company can see into the future is not very far. So they tend to be very resistant to that kind of radical change, which is what forces some people to go out on their own.
Yeah, and also the side of the box, that's another, it's the same phenomenon, that if it's too much out of the box, it's not going to be useful to the company.
Right. And sometimes that's actually true. Sometimes the concepts would be foreign to the market as well. Your public will be going, whoa, what is that?
Yeah, the public will be saying, I don't want to pay for that.
Yeah.
So that's going to have an impact on the bottom line. And whether it's in your industry, the creative industries, if society's not willing to pay for the goods, then it's not sustainable.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good reason why the symbol on your smartphone still looks like an old handheld telephone. It's recognizable.
Yes, yeah.
And, so what happens is people fall out of the corporate box and go and start their own thing. And then suddenly, overnight, they've invented something fantastic.
Yeah.
Except, of course, it wasn't overnight because they left 10 years ago and they've been working day and night, and the rest of the world has effectively caught up to them.
Mhm.
And then I just saw an article this morning from the president of the World Bank where he's talking about the fact that if we do not become more creative as a society, and if our businesses do not become more creative, we're going to start running into real problems, not just economically, but socially. Automation and AI is here, and it's going to change everything very soon, like in the next decade. The thing that we have, the thing that makes us who we are, is what brought us here. It's our ability to create, to invent, and to innovate. If we don't start to educate our children to be more aware of this, if we don't stop demonizing creatives as crazy people, as drug addicts, as misfits, as square pegs in round holes, we're doing society a grave disservice. Our attitude across the board needs to change.
Thank you very much, David. This conversation 20 years ago would not have been feasible because, you know, we didn't have broadband that was fast enough to facilitate it. So we have a lot to thank technology for allowing us new ways of communicating and being creative with each other and collaborating across the world.
Indeed.